President Ilves, there are already a lot of talks for a couple of years about, the threat from the Kremlin, what should be the answers. So the problems are already there. We've discussed this many times. At this time, can we make any assessment? Is anything had been learned by NATO, by the West, and is any way to move forward besides discussing the problems?
Well, I think NATO does have a slow learning curve, but I think that the assessment of the threats has changed substantially. It is slowly changed, yes, but it's not only the Anschluss of Crimea and the troops in the Donbass. It's also in this region all kinds of funny flights and transponderless flights. It's Putin and there's the Russians going into Syria. So all of these together have made people think more about the world, at least come to the conclusion that this is something other than what was once the post-Cold War era.
And what have Estonia learned from, defending itself from the information war, for instance?
Well, we actually have studied done an in-depth study with this, actually one from CNN too, and found out that the difference between people living in Estonia who are primarily Russian-speaking and the ones who are primarily Estonian-speaking is that the ones who are primarily Russian-speaking don't believe any media, none, zero. I mean, they just have no, which in the case of the Russian media, it's largely a useful approach to take, but unfortunately, regarding sort of serious journalism from the West, that's also discounted. I mean, I think that we need not worry as much about disinformation as I did, because we're finding more and more that people aren't paying attention to it.
We've talked shortly about this information war, which probably was a lot that was spoken about it. But in this regard, what are the limits of the freedom of speech? And are there any in this environment?
Which one? Ours or yours?
Ours and yours as well.
Well, I mean, this is a constant topic of debate, and it varies from country to country, culture to culture, but certainly I do not believe that hate speech, anything that incites violence, should be left unresponded to. I'm not a big fan of criminalizing things, but certainly you can, in fact, use the civil courts to make people understand they will pay for inciting violence.
We are very concerned now, how to counter populism. What would be the politicians' answers on populism these days in Europe and in countries like Ukraine?
Well, I think it's a new problem for us in the European Union. We have had small populist parties always, but now we see a surge in populism fueled by the refugee crisis that we face in Europe, and so we have. We'll probably have 1 million this year, and yesterday the European Commissioner Moscovici, I think, said that we expect 3 million more refugees in the next 3 years. So this has led to, I think, every country in the European Union has had a big surge in populism. Some countries in government and some countries in opposition to the government. And this is, of course, a worrying development. We talk about both left populism and right populism. Many of these parties seem to be partially funded by Russia, and so it's certainly undermining democratic will in some countries. We see that some of the populists do tend to be very pro-Russian. We see that, If you look at the UKIP, Nigel Farage thinks Putin is wonderful. In Front National in France, Miss Marine Le Pen is a big fan of Putin. So.
But this is in the Western Europe, but there are also the things here in the Baltics, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine as well. And it's very hard for the technocrats really to fight that. So what could be the answer?
Well, I mean, liberal democracy has to deal with these things in a liberal democratic way, and so you have to engage and talk to the people and convince them that's sort of simplistic populist, xenophobic attitudes are not the solution.
And also, if you speak about this region, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, if we can unite that, we see that in the people generally agree that there are values, there are freedoms, but when it comes to something, to voting, to any kind of procedure, if it's a rights of the minorities or anything else, the society is not often really supporting that, and it's the card.
Well, in my country, so far, we've been fairly lucky in that I would say the Estonian population is fairly committed still to universal democratic values. I can't talk about other countries, but so far, we're okay.
And how would you describe your relations with Moscow these days? Bearing in mind that there was, for instance, this exchange of the Estonian officer. It has happened place.
Well, we should be grateful that someone they kidnapped is given back. No, I think that has nothing to do with our relations. Well, I mean, we don't see any change. Certainly, I mean, I've heard some diplomats say, "Oh, this is a sign for the good. They returned your police officer." I go, "What do you mean, sign for the good? They kidnapped him from our territory. I mean, what's so good about? Why is this? What does that represent? That we?" So, I don't really see any change, and I think that we're fairly low on the pecking order of importance. So we're not a priority.
Do you think with the Russian moves, with the Kremlin moves in Syria, this region is kind of for some time is not in the focus of the Kremlin, and can have a bit of a risk?
Oh, I'm sure I think they can pay attention to more than one thing at a time. I mean, if we do, then I think they can. So I mean, the headlines are focused on Syria right now, but that doesn't really mean that Ukraine is not a constant concern of my government and of the countries of NATO. We have additional concerns, but no one thinks that anything is solved in Ukraine, as you saw this morning in the conference. Everyone knows, everyone follows.
Because this support is existing towards Ukraine, but there could be some expectation also from your government, from the European governments. We understand reforms, making things better, but what exactly? What would be also the measurement that things are moving forward for you?
Well, I mean, we as a sort of a country, I think all the three Baltic countries have extensive experience with reform, dramatic reform, know that it doesn't, I mean, it takes a while for them to take effect. So the real thing you need to do is do them, and then you won't see tomorrow that suddenly the corruption will decrease because you did something today. But if you do it today, that means you will see over the months and the years that in fact the society will be changing. So what would I say? Liberalizing the energy market, just because it's a drain on it's a massive drain on your economy. Really stepping up the quality of police work in an anti-corruption effort, because that is, whether it is true or not, the reputation is something that must be fixed. So that is where I think the problem lies. And I think if you, and then, I mean, there's still a fair bit of cronyism, and that's always a problem. There's cronyism in every single country I've seen. I mean, the greatest, they still have cronyism, but but sometimes it's more obvious in some places than others.
Do you think the unity in the European Union regarding Ukraine, regarding the still keeping the sanction against Russia, is still there, and what could be the obstacles?
Well, it seems that it will be there for a while. As long as Mrs. Merkel is leading the issue, the sanctions will remain. No worry about Estonia's view on this.
Okay. Thank you.